Never touch me in public. My husband whispered those 5 words into my ear on our very first night together as a married couple. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten. He simply stated a rule. Like gravity, like physics, like something I should have known without being told. And for years, I followed it perfectly. I stood beside the most feared mafia boss in the city, wearing dresses he chose, smiling when he allowed, disappearing when he demanded. I became so skilled at shrinking myself that I forgot what it felt like to take up space in my own life. Then one night, I stumbled at a charity gala. My hand reached out, just instinct, just survival, and touched his sleeve. The look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't his partner. I wasn't even his wife. I was his possession, and possessions don't get to touch their owner without permission. This is the story of how that single forbidden touch woke me up. How I walked away from a man who owned the entire city, but never owned my soul. And how choosing myself became the most dangerous and powerful decision I ever made. This story will show you that true love never demands you to become invisible, and that the most powerful thing a woman can do is choose herself. If stories about strength, self-discovery, and reclaiming your worth speak to you, hit subscribe and become part of this community. Drop a comment below. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? And if this story could help someone you know, please share it. Your support means everything to us. Now, let me take you inside that glittering room where everything began to change. This room was not designed for a party. It was a weapon, built to intimidate everyone who walked inside. It announced power without a single word ever being spoken. Light from massive crystal chandeliers poured down, hitting the marble floors like liquid diamonds. The floors were polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the slow, careful movements of powerful men in expensive, tailored suits. They spoke in quiet, controlled voices, their words carrying the weight of empires. The women beside them smiled with an elegance that came only from years of practice, knowing that every single glance in this ballroom was a calculation. This was not a charity event. It was a gathering of predators disguised in generosity. At the very center of this dangerous world stood him. He was the Mafia boss, and he did not need to shout to command the room. He simply stood still, a predator who never had to chase his prey, and the entire world came to him. True power is supposed to protect. But as she stood there, she knew his power only protected him. And you need to understand how that feels. His reputation was a physical presence, entering a room moments before he did. People did not simply walk up to him to talk. They waited, sometimes for hours, hoping to be summoned into his circle. Conversations would bend and quiet as he passed, as if the man had his own gravitational pull. His rule was built on silence, on a terrifying restraint. Everyone understood that his patience was a far more dangerous weapon than his anger. Standing next to him was his wife. She was wearing an emerald green dress. She did not wear it because she loved the color. She wore it because it was the armor he had chosen for her. The rich fabric clung to her body, a statement of elegance that was careful not to be too bold, a vision of beauty that was designed to be forgotten. Her dark hair was styled in a perfect, smooth knot at the base of her neck, an arrangement that invited no stray touches and discouraged any personal questions. Every single detail of her appearance had been decided for her long before she stepped into the armored limousine that evening. She had learned years ago not to ask for his opinion. His approval was not something you asked for. It was a condition you were expected to meet. She always stood just half a step behind him, never beside him, always just behind. Her purpose in these rooms was perfectly clear. She was to smile when someone spoke to her. She was to nod when she was introduced. She was to speak only when it was absolutely necessary, and never for long enough to draw the focus away from him. Over many years, she had mastered the art of making herself smaller without physically shrinking. She learned how to soften her own presence until she felt like quiet background music, pleasant to have around, but completely unremarkable and very easy to ignore. People would admire her from across the room. They saw the boss's beautiful wife, so elegant, so composed, so completely untouchable. But nobody ever saw how she held her hands clasped tightly in front of her fingers laced together to stop them from ever reaching for something more. Nobody ever saw the way her eyes followed him, a constant, instinctive measure of his mood, always anticipating what he might need next. Nobody saw how utterly alone she was, even when standing beside the most powerful man in the entire city. He spoke to the other men in short, clipped sentences. Business was conducted in the silence between words. Deals were implied with a slight nod or a carefully timed pause, never negotiated out loud. Power moved around him like the air itself, invisible but absolute. At one point, a man laughed too loudly across the room. His gaze flickered in that direction for a single second, and the laughter immediately choked and died. He never had to warn anyone twice. She watched him the same way a person watches a fire, with a deep respect and a deeper fear. She knew that warmth and total destruction could come from the exact same source. Their marriage had been announced to the world years ago, presented as an epic romance, but it was just another alliance. The entire city had whispered about her incredible luck, calling it a modern fairy tale. She was the woman chosen by a man who could have any woman he wanted. But what the whispers and stories never captured was that being chosen by a man like him was not the same thing as being loved. She could still remember the first few months of their marriage. She still believed his silence was a sign of his strength, that his emotional distance was a form of discipline. She had convinced herself that love did not always have to look warm and inviting. She told herself that powerful men like him showed they cared through protection, not through tenderness. It was a lesson she learned quickly. Do not ask for any affection in public. Do not interrupt his conversations. Do not reach for his hand. The most important rule had been established very early on. He had spoken it during their first major event together, leaning in so close that his mouth was right beside her ear. His voice was calm and chillingly precise when he said it. Never touch me in public. His words had not sounded cruel at the time. They sounded practical, like a law of physics, like a fundamental truth of the world that she should have already understood without being told. And so, she obeyed without question. But tonight, surrounded by the sound of fake laughter and the constant clinking of champagne glasses, the weight of that one simple rule felt heavier than ever before. The crowded room felt like it was closing in, the air growing thick and hard to breathe. She shifted her weight just slightly, and the heel of her shoe caught on the edge of a thick rug. It was a simple, clumsy mistake. Pure instinct took over. Her hand shot out to steady herself, her fingers brushing against the sleeve of his expensive suit jacket for balance. It was a small, unconscious gesture, the kind of thing a wife does 1,000 times without ever thinking about it. But in that instant, his entire body went perfectly still. He slowly, deliberately, looked down at her hand on his arm as if it were a snake, as if it were a disgusting thing that did not belong in his world. He did not pull his arm away. He did not raise his voice. Doing either of those things would have drawn attention from the people around them. Instead, he leaned in closer again, so close that his lips almost touched her ear, ensuring that only she would hear his judgment. Never touch me in public. The words were soft. They were precise. They were absolutely final. Her hand flew back to her side, as if his jacket had burned her. Blood rushed to her face, a wave of heat and shame crashing together inside her chest. In that moment, she felt completely exposed, as if a spotlight had found her in the crowd, as if everyone in the room could see the silent correction that was now carved into her posture. He straightened up immediately. He resumed his conversation as if nothing had happened. For everyone else in the ballroom, the moment was over before it began. But for her, it changed everything. Around them, the music swelled to a crescendo, glasses continued to clink, and the empty laughter echoed on. She just stood there, perfectly still, perfectly composed, and perfectly invisible, while a dangerous truth took root inside of her. She finally understood that a beautiful, luxurious life could still be a cage, and she was beginning to realize that silence was the loudest and most cruel weapon of all. The night grew darker as the gala dragged on for hours. The rule he had spoken in a whisper began to scream inside her head, becoming louder than the orchestra playing across the room. She remained beside him while the entire event revolved around his silent authority. She watched powerful men lower their voices when he walked by. She saw beautiful women offer him polite, empty smiles that never managed to reach their eyes. Fear and admiration were woven together in the air of that ballroom. Over the years, she had learned to read the atmosphere in these rooms the way a sailor learns to read the signs of a coming storm, always quiet and always careful. She knew that one single wrong move could draw the kind of attention she was never supposed to have. The humiliation from his correction lingered long after the moment was over. It settled deep inside her bones, a feeling like ice-cold water slowly soaking through the finest silk. Every laugh she heard from across the room sounded distant, like it was coming from another world. Every compliment someone paid him felt like another sharp reminder of her purpose. She was not here as a person. She was here to be displayed as an object. She was proof of his absolute control, proof of his incredible success. She was living proof that even a wife could be sculpted and polished into perfect, compliant silence. She kept her expression completely calm, a blank mask of contentment. It was an expression she had practiced in the mirror for years. It was the face of a woman who wanted nothing, who needed nothing, and who felt nothing at all. The Mafia boss moved through the crowded ballroom with a deliberate, confident ease. He accepted handshakes with a firm grip, gave a single nod when someone talked for too long, and dismissed others with nothing more than a sideways glance. He never once looked back to see if she was still following him. He did not need to. He knew that she would be there. For her, obedience had become a survival instinct. For him, it had always been an expectation. Their marriage operated on the exact same principles as his criminal empire. It was structured, it was efficient, and it was merciless toward any sign of weakness. He truly believed that chaos was born from emotion. And for him, emotion was a weakness, a luxury that a man in his position could never afford to have. She could remember a time when she had actually believed his restraint was a sign of great depth. A time when she had mistaken his cold distance for masculine discipline, and his suffocating silence for quiet strength. In the very beginning of their life together, she had admired the way he could command an entire room without ever resorting to open violence. She was impressed by the way other dangerous men seemed to fear disappointing him even more than they feared angering him. She told herself back then that a man who could rule so calmly must also be a man who loved quietly. She told herself many comforting stories in those early days, because living on false hope was so much easier than facing the devastating truth. As the long night wore on, she found herself drifting toward the edges of the grand ballroom, careful not to look like she was alone, but desperate for a single breath of fresh air. The glass doors leading to the balcony glimmered under the soft golden lights, and she longed to feel the cool night air on her skin, hoping it could steady her racing thoughts. But she would not dare move toward them without his permission. She never did anything without his permission. Instead, she waited, carefully watching his body language for the subtle signs that would tell her whether she could step away or if she must remain frozen in place at his side. He noticed her slight shift in position. He always did, even when he pretended not to see her at all. His eyes flickered toward her reflection in a large, mirrored wall, and she saw his jaw tighten just slightly. The signal was unmistakable. Not now. Maybe not ever. She immediately stopped moving. In that instant, the humiliation she felt sharpened into something much heavier, something far more dangerous. It turned into resentment, and she realized in that silent, crushing moment that the love she thought she had for him had been slowly replaced by fear. It was not a fear of his physical violence. It was a fear of his complete and total indifference. It was the fear of disappearing so completely into his shadow that one day she would forget the sound of her own voice. She thought about the woman she used to be before she met him, the woman who laughed too loud, the woman who talked with her hands when she got excited, the woman who believed that being seen was not a crime. That woman felt like a complete stranger to her now, and the profound grief of that loss tightened its grip around her chest. Across the room, some politician made a toast. He raised his glass to generosity, to legacy, and to family values. Hundreds of glasses were lifted into the air and polite applause followed. She did not lift her glass. She could not bring herself to participate in celebrating a lie. She watched him smile for the crowd, a controlled, perfectly measured expression that never came close to reaching his cold eyes. And suddenly, she understood that his greatest fear was not betrayal from his enemies or weakness in his organization. His greatest fear was exposure. He was terrified of being seen as human, of being seen as capable of softness or in need of affection. The rule finally made a terrible kind of sense that chilled her to the bone. The command to never touch him in public was never about her behavior. It was about his armor. Any display of affection threatened the indestructible image he had so carefully built for himself, and she had been sacrificed in order to preserve that image. The realization did not crash down on her. It arrived quietly, but with a devastating and permanent clarity. She was not his partner in life. She was a part of his disguise. As the orchestra began to play another song, and the crowd pressed in closer around them, she felt something deep inside of her shift. It was not rebellion, and it was not yet anger. It was awareness. And awareness, she knew, was a very dangerous thing. Yet once it exists, it can never be undone. She slowly straightened her shoulders. She lifted her chin. And for the very first time in years, she did not look at him for his approval. She looked straight ahead, out into the glittering, empty room, and she felt the faintest spark of something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Defiance. It was a small and fragile thing, but it was there, alive and waiting. And although she did not yet know what this new awareness would cost her, she understood one thing with absolute and total certainty. Silence had been the thing that kept her safe for all these years, but it had also been slowly killing her soul. And the rule that forbade her from touching him had finally drawn a line in the sand, a line she could no longer pretend not to see. A memory came for her quietly in those early hours just before the dawn, a time when the huge mansion was completely still. Even the guards standing watch outside seemed like distant shadows, instead of men with weapons and orders. It was the memory of her own name, spoken in her own voice. She was lying awake, her eyes fixed on the blank canvas of the ceiling above her. In the deep, quiet dark of the mansion, she traced the outlines of forgotten constellations. This was the first time in many years that she let herself truly remember the person she was before. She recalled the woman who existed before she mastered the art of becoming invisible. This was a time before silence was a rule for survival instead of a personal choice. A time before the concept of love was twisted into a demand for absolute obedience. Her mind drifted back to a tiny apartment, a place so full of books they threatened to spill from their crooked shelves. She could almost smell the aroma of cheap, strong coffee that greeted her every morning. She remembered a version of herself who laughed freely, a sound that came without effort or calculation. She remembered sharing her thoughts and ideas without the chilling fear of being punished or corrected for having them. She saw herself standing before a classroom, the fine white dust of chalk coating her fingertips. She felt that old surge of excitement in her chest as young students leaned in, their eyes wide, listening intently because she made them feel important. In that life, her voice had carried weight. Her very presence had mattered. In that other life, she had been a person, not a beautiful object positioned strategically next to a man of great power. The memory of that person brought a pain far sharper than the cold, hard marble floors of the grand mansion ever could. It hurt because it was a reminder of a time she was vibrantly alive, in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with extravagant luxury or the shield of protection. She had made a choice to be with him, fully believing she was choosing a partner, a companion. She thought his considerable strength would stand alongside her own, a complementary force, not a shadow that would completely swallow her light. She could still recall how he used to watch her during those initial days of their relationship. He was always quiet, his gaze intense, like he was studying a complex puzzle he was determined to figure out. At the time, she had mistaken his cold scrutiny for genuine interest. She had confused his need for absolute control with a powerful sense of confidence. And so, when he warned her that the world was a very dangerous place, she believed every word. She believed him because love has a way of making fear sound exactly like care. As the months bled into years, her transformation was so gradual, so subtle, that she hardly even recognized it was happening at all. It began with small things that barely registered. Invitations to events were suddenly declined for her, always explained as a kindness to save her from social obligations. Then her clothes were chosen for her, each outfit selected to project a certain image. Her very tone of voice was meticulously adjusted to match his prevailing mood. Over time, she learned which kinds of questions would cause him irritation and which types of silence earned his approval. She came to understand that showing too much happiness attracted unwanted attention, and that kind of attention always led to some form of correction. So, she began to fold herself inward, piece by painful piece. The woman who once adored literature and engaged in long, passionate conversations, the woman with a messy, unrestrained laugh, slowly vanished. In her place was a quiet, polished reflection that always walked half a step behind him. The true danger hidden beneath all the luxury finally showed itself. It was not a danger of physical violence, but one of systematic erasure. The mansion was undeniably beautiful, but it was a beauty that echoed with a profound absence. Every room was filled with priceless objects, yet completely devoid of any real warmth. She moved through these opulent spaces like a phantom, careful to touch nothing, determined to leave no trace of her existence. The household staff treated her with respect, but they did not truly know her. The security guards acknowledged her, but only ever as a physical extension of the man she belonged to. Eventually, even her own name started to feel hollow, as if it had lost its meaning. It was spoken only when formal protocol made it absolutely necessary. But that night, at the glittering gala, something she had buried deep inside for years was forced open. His rule, whispered to her in the crowd, did not just bring her shame. That rule served as a brutal awakening. She finally understood that the rule had been in effect long before he ever spoke the words aloud. It had silently governed every single one of her public appearances, shaped every conversation she ever had, and directed every step she took while at his side. The command, "Never touch me in public," meant so much more. It meant never dare to remind the world that he was a human being with human connections. More importantly, it meant never allow yourself to remember that you exist as a separate person. A new kind of fear began to settle deep in her chest. It was not a fear of him, but a terrifying fear of what would become of her if she allowed her life to continue this way. In her mind, she saw a clear vision of herself 10 years into the future, still standing silently by his side, still waiting for unspoken permission to act or speak, still trying to convince herself that this kind of survival was actually enough. That single thought hollowed her out more completely than any spoken threat he could ever make. She had a moment of startling clarity. The most dangerous part of the life she was living was not the immense power that constantly surrounded her. The real danger was how that power had systematically trained her to accept a life of complete nothingness as if it were normal. As the very first hint of morning light began to push through the thick, heavy curtains of the bedroom, she made a silent decision. It was a decision that did not yet have a clear plan or a final destination attached to it. She would simply begin to pay attention again. She would focus on all the parts of herself that she had been forced to abandon over the years. She would start by remembering her own voice, even if she did not feel brave enough to use it just yet. She would remember what it felt like to be truly seen by another person, even if no one was currently looking at her. This new awareness began to settle inside her like a slow-burning fire, and she was keenly aware of the risk it carried. She knew that awareness would eventually lead to questions, and questions would lead to choices, and choices, she understood, would always lead to consequences. She was, for now, still the wife of a man who was deeply feared. She was still under his protection, still constantly watched, and still completely enveloped by his power. But beneath the expensive silk dresses and the suffocating silence, a profound change had occurred. The invisible wife had finally started to see herself again. And once that process began, she knew there was no going back. The very same luxury that had once felt like a shield of safety now began to feel like a trap, its steel jaws waiting patiently to close shut around her forever. The final decision did not come with a storm of drama or a flood of tears. It arrived in a moment of silence so total that it startled her awake long before the dawn. It was the lowest hour of the mansion's breath, a time when even the ancient walls seemed to be listening. She lay perfectly still in bed, counting the seconds that passed between each of her own breaths. She was acutely aware that this particular moment was different from all the rest. It was different because, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was not waiting for someone to grant her permission to exist. Moving with a quiet grace, she rose from the bed and began to dress in the dim, gray light of the early morning. She carefully selected clothes that were designed not to draw any attention. They were not elegant, not symbolic, and certainly not anything he had ever paid her a compliment for wearing. The sound of her skirt's zipper closing seemed to echo through the room, far louder than it should have. Her heart began to race in her chest, as if she expected security alarms to start blaring at any second. She held her breath, fully expecting to hear footsteps approaching in the hall, the sharp click of a door handle turning, or the low commanding voice that could stop her with a single uttered word. But none of those sounds came, and that profound absence of a reaction frightened her even more than any resistance would have. The mansion, which had once felt so imposing and grand, now felt sinister and watchful. She moved through its halls barefoot, the cold of the polished floors seeping into her skin. She passed by massive portraits and heavy sculptures, all chosen to project a legacy of dominance and power. She realized that none of it had ever belonged to her. Now she understood that it never would. Even the bedroom where she had slept beside him for years felt like a borrowed space, like an elaborate stage set being dismantled in the stark light of day. She did not take any of the jewelry he had given her. She did not take any of his expensive gifts. She took only the few things she absolutely needed to survive. Taking anything more would have felt like asking for his permission after she had already gone. Outside the massive front doors, the sky was just beginning to turn from black to a pale, washed-out gray. The guards stationed at the main gate were only half awake, their training focused on watching for threats coming in, not on watching for someone departing. She walked right past them. She held her head high while her heart pounded against her ribs. Every single step she took was an act of rebellion, all of it wrapped in a cloak of outward calm. Not one person tried to stop her. No one even questioned her, because no one could ever imagine a scenario where she would choose to leave. It was in that moment that she realized just how deeply they had all underestimated her. She also understood how incredibly dangerous that single assumption was about to become for them. The city that lay beyond the gates felt like another world. The streets stretched out before her, wide and unclaimed. Every sound seemed sharper, brighter, and more alive. She took a deep breath, inhaling a mixture of freedom, fear, and a strange kind of grief. A car came down the street, and she lifted her hand to hail it without even thinking. The gesture felt so simple, so ordinary, so completely human. And when the driver pulled over and looked at her, he did not see her as an extension of someone's power. He just saw a woman standing alone on the corner. The simple humanity of that look nearly caused her to break down completely. As the car pulled away from the curb and drove off, she made a conscious choice not to look back at the mansion. She knew with absolute certainty that if she did, the immense weight of everything she was leaving behind might be enough to pull her back under its influence. So instead, She focused her attention on the road stretching out ahead of her. She focused on the vast uncertainty that was waiting for her, a future with no protection and no privilege. Every mile the car traveled put more distance between her and the man who believed that silence was the ultimate form of control, and that possession was the same thing as love. He finally discovered her absence many hours later, when the perfect routine of his morning failed him, when the house simply remained too quiet for far too long. The members of his staff moved around him with extreme care, their eyes lowered to the floor, all of them sensing a dangerous shift in the atmosphere of the house. He stood motionless in the doorway of their bedroom, his eyes scanning the entire space, as if she might suddenly materialize out of thin air if he just stared hard enough. The perfectly made bed, the empty side of the closet, the complete and total absence of her presence, it all struck him with a deep confusion that he immediately mistook for anger. She had not left him with a dramatic confrontation or a tearful note. She had only left him with a single, undeniable fact. She was gone. And that quiet reality unsettled him far more than any act of open defiance ever could have. He was a man accustomed to enemies who loudly announced themselves, to threats that demanded an immediate and overwhelming response. This was something entirely different. This was a loss, a piece of his world that he could not command or bully back into its proper place. The rule he had enforced without a second thought now echoed endlessly in his mind, and for the very first time, he found himself wondering not about what she had done, but about why she had done it. Meanwhile, she was sitting all alone in a small, cheap room that smelled faintly of strong detergent and unfamiliar air. Her single suitcase was at her feet, and her hands were trembling as the full reality of her choice finally began to settle in. Fear washed over her in relentless waves, but she discovered something steadier just beneath it, something solid and undeniable. She had finally crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and the world had not collapsed around her. She had no idea what was going to happen next. Her only certainty was that going back was no longer an option. The invisible wife had deliberately stepped out into the bright, harsh light without any of her armor, without any of his protection, and most importantly, without anyone's permission. Somewhere in the deepest part of her being, she finally understood that survival would no longer be about obedience. From this day forward, survival would be about the long and difficult process of becoming whole again, no matter what the cost might be. The days that followed this decision unfolded at a crawl, as if time itself was being cautious and gentle around her. She woke up each and every morning in a series of unfamiliar rooms, surrounded by unfamiliar sounds from the city outside. And for the very first time in years, there was no one there to dictate where she needed to be or how she was supposed to move through her day. That newfound freedom felt incredibly fragile, almost like a dream. It felt like something that could be snatched away from her if she dared to reach for it too quickly. She slowly learned how to simply sit with that uncertain feeling. Instead of trying to fight against it, she allowed the quiet in her life to become her trusted companion rather than her enemy. She eventually chose a small apartment on the complete other side of the city, in a neighborhood where nobody knew her name and no one paid any attention to her comings and goings. The living space was modest. It had floors that creaked when she walked and large windows that let the sunlight spill in without first asking for permission. She began to fill the apartment very slowly, choosing only simple things. She bought a kettle that whistled loudly when the water was hot. She purchased old books from secondhand stores. She found a comfortable chair and placed it by the window, creating a spot where she could just sit and think without being observed by anyone. Each one of these small choices felt like she was reclaiming a tiny piece of the self that had been locked away for so long. Money also became real to her, in a way it had never been before in her life. There were no bank accounts that had been opened in her name by somebody else. There were no credit cards handed to her with silent, unspoken rules attached to their use. She learned the true weight and value of each and every purchase she made, and she found an unexpected sense of pride in her own restraint. A quiet fear always lingered at the very edge of her thoughts. It was not a fear of being found by him, but a deeper fear of failing completely on her own. Yet even that specific fear felt more honest and real than the polished, silent terror that had defined her former life. It was during one of those perfectly ordinary days that she met the new man. The meeting was not dramatic. It was not a coincidence so heavy that it felt like it was scripted for a movie. She was just sitting in a small neighborhood coffee shop, looking through online job listings, when he politely asked her if the empty seat across from her table was taken. His voice was different. It carried no trace of authority, no hint of a threat. It held only genuine warmth and a simple human curiosity. She paused for a moment, a conditioned response from a lifetime of caution, but then she agreed with a simple nod. To her own surprise, the interaction felt completely effortless. Their words flowed back and forth, free from the heavy weight of hidden meanings or the need to perform a role. He described his career in public education, telling her about the forgotten communities and the resilient students who served as a constant reminder that having a purpose was far more valuable than holding power. When she shared her own thoughts, he gave her his full attention. He genuinely absorbed what she said, never once interrupting, never trying to steer the conversation, and never comparing her words to some preconceived image he needed her to be. Without her even realizing it, a knot of tension deep inside her began to unwind. She let out a soft laugh at something he said, and the unexpected sound seemed to startle them both. He never inquired about her history, and she felt no pressure to volunteer it. This complete absence of expectation created a profound sense of security. As they went their separate ways, he wished her well with a warmth that was clearly genuine, then turned and left without a second glance. The pure simplicity of that brief encounter lingered in her mind for much longer than she expected. It was not the spark of romance that held her thoughts, but the profound feeling of being treated with respect. Miles away, in a world she had abandoned, the man she had left behind was starting to truly register the void her departure had created in his life. His operations continued without interruption, and the reports from his subordinates still arrived precisely on schedule. The loyalty he commanded seemed unshaken, but the silence in his home no longer felt like a symbol of his control. While his empire ran like a well-oiled machine, he could feel that a critical component was now gone, and this absence agitated him in a way he could not quite define or understand. He confidently told himself that she would eventually come back to him. He believed her pride would eventually crumble under the weight of fear, because in his world, that was the unfailing dynamic of power. But as the days slowly bled into weeks with no word from her, his quiet irritation began to sharpen into a genuine, gnawing unease. He instructed his men to begin a careful search, telling them to use precision, not force. He wanted information, not rumors. He did not want his authority to show any cracks, and he certainly did not want any weakness exposed. With every single report that came back empty, however, the pit in his stomach deepened. She was not cowering in some dark corner, hiding from his reach. She was out in the world, simply living her life. That simple truth disturbed him on a level that open defiance never could have. In another part of the city, she started the long process of looking for a job, carefully rebuilding her identity with each small, honest action. Every polite rejection was a minor sting, but none of them were enough to shatter her determination. For the very first time, her personal value was not being determined by her connection to a powerful man. She was slowly becoming visible to herself again, and this quiet, internal transformation was proving to be more potent than any weapon he had ever wielded. The empty space she had left in his life was beginning to eat away at the very foundations of his control, a subtle corrosion that no rival had ever accomplished. The grand mansion remained standing, protected by his guards and shrouded in silence. The long hallways still seemed to echo with the sound of absolute obedience, but now the very air within the walls felt defiant, as if it no longer recognized him as its master. He first became aware of it in the quiet stillness of the mornings, when he noticed the house no longer seemed to revolve around his existence as it once had. There were no longer soft, nearly silent footsteps, anticipating his every desire. No quiet presence dedicated solely to his comfort. The profound silence that had once been a confirmation of his absolute power now felt heavy, pressing in on him like a silent accusation. He tried to convince himself that this was merely a temporary situation. He was certain that she would return as soon as the fantasy of her new freedom was crushed by the harsh realities of the world. Fear had always been the tool that brought people back into his orbit, and he had no reason to believe it would fail him this time. And yet, as more days passed without a sign of her, his unwavering certainty started to develop hairline fractures. The daily reports from his most trusted men were consistently clean, professional, and completely useless. She was not hiding in terror. She was not desperately seeking another protector. She had simply vanished, choosing to build a life somewhere beyond the limits of his influence without ever asking for his permission. The next emotion to surface was anger. It was a sharp and all-consuming fire, but it was an anger with no target, no place to strike. He found himself pacing the length of his study deep into the night, endlessly replaying small moments that he had previously dismissed as completely meaningless. Her quiet, observant glances, the carefully controlled way she held herself, the subtle way she had stopped reaching for him in casual moments long before he had ever registered the change. His own memory had become a weapon that was now turned against him, and he hated it with a cold fury. He had commanded men who would take a life without a moment of hesitation. Yet all his power was useless when it came to commanding the return of one woman who had simply made the choice to walk away. During his public appearances, his facade remained perfect. He was composed, unshakable, and as feared as ever. But just beneath that carefully constructed surface, something deeply unstable was beginning to shift. He started to watch other couples on the street with a potent mix of irritation, deep confusion, and something that felt dangerously close to envy. He saw hands held openly in the light of day. He heard unguarded laughter that echoed freely in the air. He witnessed a softness and vulnerability displayed between two people without any negative consequences. It disturbed him more than any direct threat ever had, because it highlighted a fundamental weakness within himself that he had spent his entire life training to ignore. He intensified his search for her, but he did so with restraint rather than violence. He knew that causing chaos would be an admission that he had lost control, and control was the only language he had ever learned to trust. Still, every failed attempt to find her chipped away at the core belief that everything and everyone in his world ultimately belonged to him. For the first time in his life, he was forced to confront a truth he had never before needed to consider. Ownership was only real when the other person chose to accept it. Across the city, she continued to put the pieces of her life back together, quietly and methodically, completely unaware of the storm that her absence was stirring. She navigated her days with a newfound caution, but also with a clear sense of purpose, slowly learning how to trust her own instincts once more. The simple freedom of choosing her own daily schedule felt like a revolutionary act. A knot of fear still resided deep in her chest, a constant reminder of her past, but it no longer dictated her every action. When she crossed paths with the man from the coffee shop for a second time, the encounter was entirely accidental and ordinary, yet it caused another significant shift within her. He greeted her with a genuine warmth, not with the slightest hint of possession. He had remembered her name without needing to use it as a tool of assertion. Their conversation picked up with a natural ease, built upon a foundation of mutual curiosity rather than a desire for control. She paid close attention to the way he listened to her without his eyes constantly scanning the room for threats or opportunities. She noted how he offered his attention as a gift, not as a form of currency to be exchanged. The stark contrast between the two men in her life began to crystallize in her mind, not as a simple comparison, but as a moment of profound clarity. One of them had ruled her life through a calculated silence and an imposing distance. The other connected with her through his focused presence and his genuine respect. It was in that moment that she finally realized the thing that terrified her the most. It was not the physical danger she had managed to escape, but the horrifying possibility that she had once convinced herself that this danger was a form of love. At that same moment, The Mafia boss stood in the very heart of his vast empire, feeling an unfamiliar sensation begin to creep into his bones. It was the cold chill of doubt. He had lost many things throughout his life, including rivals, territory, and strategic alliances. But he had never before lost something that had made the conscious choice to leave him. This new reality gnawed at him without mercy because it tore away the carefully constructed illusion that his control was absolute. For the very first time, the question that echoed in his mind was not how he could force her to come back, but why she had never fought to stay in the first place. That one question haunted him in the stillness of the night. It whispered profound truths that he had spent his entire life actively ignoring. For years he had operated under the belief that silence was his greatest weapon, a source of ultimate strength. Now, he was being forced to see that his silence was also a form of profound abandonment. This dawning awareness was the start of a deep and catastrophic loss, one he was completely unprepared to confront. He finally saw her at a moment he never could have predicted, inside a room that was built to eliminate all surprises. It was a lavish charity gala, a spectacle of velvet and crystal carefully staged to sanitize the public images of men just like him. As was his custom, he arrived late, because controlling time was just another method of controlling people. The instant he walked in, conversations faltered and died. Heads turned in his direction before quickly looking down. The familiar energy of fear and deference radiated from him, creating a path through the crowded room. He methodically surveyed the hall, a lifelong habit of identifying threats and assessing shifting loyalties. And that is when his gaze locked on something that felt like a punch to his soul, stealing all the air from his lungs. She was standing near the far wall of the ballroom, illuminated by a warm, golden spotlight. A genuine, unrestrained laugh escaped her lips as she spoke with a man. He leaned into her words, not with a sense of possession, but with deep and sincere attention. Her entire posture was relaxed and open, completely without defense. Her hands were not folded in front of her or held tightly in that restrained way he remembered so well. They were free. That sound, her honest laughter, hit him with more force than any shouted insult. It was real. A sudden, violent clarity washed over him as he understood he had never heard that sound in all the years she was with him. A strange and savage jealousy ignited inside him, a raw fire that burned just beneath his skin. He watched the man beside her smile. It was not the smile of a man who owned power, but of one who willingly shared his space. The man's hand gently brushed her arm for a moment, a touch meant to connect, not to claim. And in that moment she did not flinch. She did not recoil. She did not make herself smaller. She did not instinctively scan the room to see if she had permission for this simple human contact. That single image shattered something buried deep within him, because it starkly revealed everything he had taken from her without ever understanding its value. Her fear of him had never been a sign of her respect, and her profound silence had never been a symbol of her devotion. It had been nothing more than survival. He felt the entire room begin to tilt on its axis, as the primary rule he had so strictly enforced echoed back at him with perfect clarity: never touch me in public. And he understood in that devastating moment that the rule had never been about protecting him or his image. It had only ever been about keeping her small enough for him to control. He began to move before his logical mind could stop him, slicing through the dense crowd with a singular purpose that unnerved even his own bodyguards. This was not a calculated strategic move. This was a raw instinct that had been sharpened over weeks into a dangerous obsession. When she finally looked up and saw him approaching, her joyful laughter did not curdle into fear. Instead, it simply faded, replaced by a calm and unshakable composure. And that quiet composure wounded his pride more deeply than any display of anger ever could have. She did not take a single step back from him. She did not reach for his arm in a gesture of submission. She did not glance at the man beside her for protection or guidance. She simply met his intense gaze with her own, her expression calm, steady, and completely unafraid. In that single silent moment, He knew with absolute certainty that he had lost something that could never be reclaimed by force, because it had never truly belonged to him in the first place. The two of them stood there, facing each other while the noise of the gala continued to swirl around them, the other guests completely oblivious to the silent war that was unfolding between them. He searched her face, desperately looking for the woman who used to anticipate his every command, who waited for his cues before she acted. In her place, he found a stranger, a woman who seemed completely anchored in her own being. When he finally spoke her name, the words sounded alien in his own mouth, stripped of all its former authority. And when he demanded to know what she was doing there, she answered him without a trace of an apology in her voice, calmly explaining her new work, her renewed purpose, her own choice. Each word she spoke methodically dismantled the docile version of her that he had kept locked away in his mind. The man who had been standing beside her took a respectful step back, not out of fear of him, but out of respect for her. He was giving her the space to speak for herself, and that simple, decent act served to highlight everything that he himself had never once offered her. A hot surge of rage threatened to boil over, but just beneath it, something far more dangerous and profound began to take hold: recognition. He was forced to recognize that he had mistaken possession for love, that he had mistaken her silence for strength, and that he had mistaken her obedience for true loyalty. As he watched her stand before him, completely unafraid and utterly unchanged by his powerful presence, he felt control pour through his fingers like fine sand. The absolute rule that had once defined the very structure of their marriage was shattered into a million pieces, not because she had broken it, but because she simply no longer lived her life by it. Surrounded by the immense power he had so carefully constructed, a crushing realization struck him far too late. The one thing he had truly lost was the single thing his power could never reclaim for him: her freedom. The air between them grew thick and heavy, more suffocating than the pressing crowd that swirled around them. It was as if the very atmosphere could sense the fundamental shift in their world. He stood there, frozen, expecting the familiar response his presence always commanded. He waited for the flicker of fear in her eyes. He looked for the hesitation in her posture. He listened for the quiet obedience that had defined their past. But absolutely nothing came. She did not drop her gaze to the floor. She did not soften her stance to appear smaller. She did not carefully measure her words to ensure her own safety. Instead, she looked directly at him, her calm a force of nature that unsettled him more profoundly than any loud act of defiance ever could. He was the first to speak, because silence, once his greatest weapon, no longer served his purpose. His voice was a familiar instrument of authority, a command born from years of habit, but underneath it, a tremor of strain echoed, a jagged edge he could not possibly smooth away. He finally asked her why she was even there, as if the question alone possessed the magic to restore the old order and put her back in her place. She gave him a simple answer, explaining the work she was now doing. She spoke of the people she was serving and the deep sense of purpose she had discovered on her own. Her words were not rushed or panicked. They did not tremble with fear. They landed with a quiet, unshakable certainty. Every single sentence she spoke systematically dismantled another layer of the illusion he had so carefully constructed around her and their life together. He tried to pull out his old weapons, reminding her of everything he had given her. He listed protection, immense wealth, and the safety that came with his name. He spoke of the respect that name commanded from others. These were his time-tested defenses, the tactics that had always worked without fail in the past. She just listened patiently, never once interrupting him. It was in that profound silence that he finally understood. She was no longer having an argument with him, not even inside her own mind. When she finally chose to speak, her voice held no bitterness and offered no apology. It carried only the simple, undeniable weight of truth. She told him that he had given her many things, but he had never offered a true partnership. He had provided her with comfort, but never with genuine respect. He had granted her safety from the outside world, but he had never given her freedom from him. The noisy crowd around them faded into a meaningless, blurry background as her words found a way into places no enemy's weapon had ever reached. She explained that the very rule he had enforced with such meticulous care had taught her a painful lesson. It showed her exactly where she stood within his world, and just how little space she was allowed to occupy inside it. His command, "Never touch me in public," had not protected his power. Instead, it had exposed its true nature. It had revealed to her that he considered affection a profound weakness, a vulnerability he refused to ever show. That weakness became her secret burden to carry alone for years. For the very first time in his life, he tried something completely unfamiliar to him: an explanation. He spoke of constant danger, of maintaining appearances, and of enemies who were always watching, waiting for any crack in his armor. He tried to make her understand that any display of softness was an invitation for destruction. He told her that absolute control was the only way to survive in the world he inhabited. She did not bother to argue with his logic, because she now understood it better than he ever could. Instead, she told him in a quiet voice that survival without a self was not a victory at all. It was just a slow, painful disappearance. She confessed that she had almost vanished completely before she finally woke up and saw what his protection was truly costing her. From a distance, the man she was with now simply watched. He did not interfere. He did not try to assert his presence. That powerful restraint hit him with a brutal and sudden clarity. True respect did not require domination over another person. Real protection did not demand the complete erasure of someone's soul. He saw it then, in that moment, what she had been denied for all those years. It was the fundamental right to exist without constantly shrinking herself to fit into his world. The entire power dynamic that he had depended on for so long finally cracked and shattered under the immense weight of this new understanding. He found himself standing on the edge of something genuinely dangerous. It was not the threat of violence, but the threat of vulnerability. The feeling terrified him more than bloodshed ever had. He desperately wanted to tell her that he could change. He wanted to promise that he could learn to be different, that he could finally make space for her now. But even as the thought began to form in his mind, he recognized the exact same truth that she had already accepted long ago. A promise of change that is only offered after a great loss is not an act of love. It is simply a desperate fear of the consequences. She told him she was not standing there to punish him. She was not trying to replace him or to prove some kind of point. She was standing there because she had rebuilt herself from the ground up, piece by painful piece. She would not dismantle that incredible progress for anyone, not even for him. Her words were not delivered with cruelty, yet they managed to cut deeper than any rage ever could have. They closed the door between them permanently, but without the finality of a slam. He searched her face one last time, desperately hoping to find a hint of regret, a flicker of longing, or even a moment of hesitation. He found only a profound and settled peace. That peace was the final, devastating blow. It was then that he understood completely. Control had never made him strong. It had only ever made him incredibly alone. The woman he had always believed belonged to him had chosen a life for herself where silence was no longer a currency she was willing to pay. As she turned away from him to rejoin the man who waited without a hint of possession, the entire room seemed to tilt on its axis again. This time, however, he did not follow her. He remained exactly where he was, completely surrounded by his influence and the fear he inspired. A fortress of power that suddenly felt utterly and completely hollow. The confrontation was over. There was no victory to claim. There had been no violence. There would be no reconciliation. In that quiet, anticlimactic ending, he finally and fully understood the true cost of the rule he had enforced so casually for so long. By demanding that she never touch him in a public space, he had unintentionally taught her exactly how to walk away from him forever. The truth did not strike him like a bolt of lightning. It unfolded slowly and deliberately as the noise of the large event began to fade into the background. The incredible weight of what had just been said began to settle into the quiet spaces between each of his breaths. He continued to stand in the exact spot where she had left him, surrounded by countless people who still feared his name. And yet, for the first time in his entire life, that fear felt completely and utterly useless. For his entire life, power had been his most reliable tool, an extension of his will that never failed. Yet now, it was utterly useless, unable to grasp the one thing he desperately wanted back. A profound injustice burned in him. How could he command empires but not her heart? He watched her move across the space between them, her steps measured and calm, showing neither rush nor reluctance. She was an underdog who had found her strength. She did not glance back, because his approval was no longer the sun her world orbited. The man waiting for her stood with a quiet openness, a presence offering partnership, not ownership. The difference was a physical blow, and a lifetime of certainty shattered inside him. He had to try one last time, his voice not angry now, but raw with the terror of his loss, as he called out her name. If you want to understand how it all fell apart, you have to see this moment. She turned, but it was on her own terms, an act of choice, not a response to a summons. That single distinction remade the world. Standing just a few feet away, he instinctively lowered his voice, clinging to the ghost of his former authority. Then he asked the question that had been scorching his mind from the instant he saw her smiling with someone else. Was this his fault? Had she found a replacement, leaving him behind? The question was a window into his soul, revealing the possessiveness he mistook for love, and she saw it all. Her expression was the hardest part to bear. She looked at him with a strange gentleness, free of any victory or spite, and that kindness was more unsettling than hate. When her words finally came, they were slow and deliberate, each one chosen to be both true and devastating. She explained the one truth he had refused to see. Even if that other man had never existed, she still would not be coming back to him. That revelation landed in the space between them like a sharp blade wrapped in soft silk. His breath caught in his throat as the meaning of her words settled deep inside him, final and irreversible. This was not about jealousy, which she was now curing. This was not about loneliness, which she was now escaping. It was the life she had been forced to live with him that she could never, ever go back to. She told him plainly that she left because she had completely lost herself while standing beside him. She explained that a love that demands total silence is not love at all. She said protection that completely erases your identity is not safety. He tried to speak, to form an argument, but the words no longer came together the way they used to. His offers of wealth, power, and security all sounded completely hollow now. They were stripped of the powerful illusion that they could ever be enough to make up for what she had lost. She explained that the most painful part of their life together had not been his intentional cruelty. It was his complete and total unawareness. It was the way he never even noticed her shrinking, and never once questioned why she had stopped reaching for him long before he had to tell her not to. She made it perfectly clear that the other man had not saved her. He had not replaced him. She was no longer an object to be claimed or transferred from one owner to another. She had saved herself, quietly, deliberately, and entirely without his permission. The new life she was building for herself was not dependent on romance. It was founded on her own choices. She said that if she ever decided to choose love again, it would be from a position of absolute equality, not from a place of desperate need. Those words stripped him bare in a way that physical violence never could. He finally realized in that moment that he had not lost her to another man. He had lost her to her own awareness. And once awareness truly takes hold, control becomes a useless and pathetic tool. His massive empire still stood, but its very foundation suddenly felt incredibly fragile. It had been built entirely on fear, rather than on any real connection. She looked at him one last time, and he saw there was no anger left in her eyes. There was no satisfaction, only a crystal clear understanding. She told him she hoped he would one day learn the lesson he had taught her completely by accident. She said that power without respect is an empty and lonely thing, and that silence is not a sign of strength. Then she turned away from him for good. Her departure was not dramatic, it was not defiant, it was simply and irreversibly final. He stood completely alone as the crowd closed in around him once again, and for the very first time in his entire life, he understood that the most shocking kind of loss was not being replaced by someone else. It was being left behind by someone who no longer needed to escape you. She had not chosen another man over him. She had, in the end, chosen herself. And that devastating truth followed him long after the room finally emptied and the long night came to an end. It left him alone to face the enormous consequences of a simple rule that had ultimately cost him absolutely everything. The city continued to move on, just the way it always did. It was completely indifferent to the private wars that reshaped entire lives behind closed doors and beneath the glare of bright lights. Yet for him, everything had fundamentally changed, even though nothing visible in his life had fallen apart. His vast empire remained completely intact. His powerful name still commanded fear and respect. His men still followed his orders without a single question. But something absolutely essential had been stripped away from his core, and no amount of power in the world could ever retrieve it. He returned to his massive mansion that night, and for the very first time, he understood just how empty the place had always been. The silence that once obeyed his every command now seemed to mock him from every corner. Every single room in the vast house now carried the heavy echo of the person he had erased. The immense weight of that realization settled onto his shoulders, a burden he could not shrug off. Days turned into weeks, and he did not send his men to find her again. He finally understood the truth she had handed him as a parting gift that night. She was not in hiding. She was simply choosing her own path. Using force would only prove what she already knew to be true about him. Instead, he found himself confronting memories he had spent years carefully burying. He remembered moments when she had waited patiently for just a glance from him, a single word, any small sign that she actually mattered to him. These were moments he had carelessly dismissed at the time because they did not serve the powerful image he wanted to project. He could see it so clearly now. Every single time he had demanded distance from her, he had carved another deep wound into her spirit and had called it discipline. In the silent weeks that followed, he started to pick apart the very foundations of his identity. It was not a public spectacle, but a private, agonizing demolition of the principles he had lived by. He began to see the revelation clearly. Fear had been the architect of his entire life. It was a brilliant and terrible tool that had built his fortune but had annihilated any chance for real connection. Fear was how he commanded loyalty from his employees and obedience from his partners, but it was also the poison that suffocated love before it could ever take root. In that quiet, painful understanding, he confronted the most formidable opponent he had ever faced, the man he had been. Miles away, she was constructing a new existence, one that was entirely her own design. She chose her work, her friends, and the simple, peaceful rhythm of her days, all shaped by her own purpose, not by his permission. Loud voices no longer made her flinch. She had finally learned to occupy her own space in the world, to trust her own presence without needing anyone else to validate it. This trust was a quiet revolution that changed everything around her. The man who now walked by her side did so as an equal, without the slightest hint of ownership or demand. He was not there to complete her, because she was already whole. He was there to respect her, and that single distinction made all the difference. Time began to sand down the sharpest edges of their shared past, but it never erased the lessons she had learned. Then one afternoon, in the most ordinary of places, their paths crossed again. It was a small cafe, filled with the murmur of quiet conversations and shafts of afternoon sun. He saw her first, the way he always had, but this time a strange thing happened. The familiar surge of rage and desperate longing never came. In its place, something calm settled in his chest. It was acceptance. She looked genuinely at peace, and for the first time, that peace felt like an answer, not an accusation. She met his gaze across the room and gave him a small, deliberate nod. It was a gesture of finality, a quiet closing of a door, not an invitation to reconcile. In that single silent moment, he finally understood the lesson he had fought so hard against. Love was never proven by how tightly you could hold on. It was not about possession or control. Its truest measure was the ability to let someone go without letting bitterness take their place. She turned back to her life and continued on her way, a person moving forward. He stayed in his seat, watching the city flow past the window, filled with countless lives he could never command, and endless futures he would never dictate. That evening, he made a choice. It was not a plan to reclaim what was gone, but a vow to rebuild what was left of him. He began the slow work of dismantling his own empire of fear. He started investing in people instead of dominating them, in teaching instead of silencing. It was a slow and brutal process, a transformation that offered no applause. But for the very first time in his life, his actions were not being driven by how they would look to others. They were motivated by a genuine, hard-won understanding. Her story was now completely separate from his, and that was the most profound truth he had to accept. This was never about winning or losing. She had not won because she replaced him, and he had not lost because another man existed. The story's end was not about romance, and it was certainly not about revenge. It was about identity. She had fought to reclaim the person she was meant to be. In doing so, she had taught him the most expensive lesson of his life. True love does not shrink people to fit into a smaller world. It gives them the space to expand. Any power that builds its foundation on demanding silence from others will, in the end, find itself standing completely and utterly alone.